I always set my timer so I make sure that I don't go on and bore people. We've been holding conferences internationally to promote and make people aware of this report, which has just come out at the end of last year. The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. It is a successor report to a report that we wrote in January of 1997. And that report was called The New Silk Road, the Eurasian Land Bridge, Locomotive for World Economic Development. What I want to first state is that the proposal of New Silk Road is our proposal. It was originated by our organization, and specifically by Lyndon and Helga LaRouche in 1993, and was discussed in China at that time. It took 3 years to organize a conference, which occurred in June of 1996, involving 37 nations in Shanghai. Also, portions of the conference happened in Beijing. Helga LaRouche attended that conference and gave a keynote presentation, one of the keynote presentations at that conference at that time. And the proposals, which you can see when you are able to purchase or otherwise acquire the report, on the back of the report are an updated version of proposals that we outlined then, and also we included those that have been done. Most of the proposals we made at that time actually, or many of them at least, have been completed. What is relevant about, in specific, it was not that we completely solely originated anything. I don't mean to say that. There were 3 branches of the Silk Road policy in 1997, 2 of which had originated with both the Russian and Chinese governments. The third arm of that proposal, which was to extend the road into Southeast Asia, was recently adopted by President Xi Jinping in his discussions in Indonesia in October, actually, of 2013. So what I'm going to do is to simply first indicate something about what it is or why it is that we did what we did. I'm not going to give a history. As I said, I want to keep it short and keep us to questions. You have received our recent copy of Executive Intelligence Review magazine, The Hamilton Principle Revived in New York City. It begins with an article by myself and essentially sort of gives a characterization of a conference that we held on the occasion of the Martin Luther King weekend in New York. Helga LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, spoke there. She's the one that is the most associated with our World Land Bridge policy, and she was, as I say, the keynote speaker back in 1996. She has been called or termed the Silk Road Lady because of her extensive discussions with the Chinese, including Chinese governmental circles over the years. And the importance of saying all this is to first contextualize the other remarks I'm here to make. Sometimes, because of the way in which Executive Intelligence Review and Mr. Lyndon LaRouche have interacted with governments, particularly the American government, the United States government, particularly since 1981, at which point LaRouche was a negotiator, an off-the-record back-channel negotiator with the then Soviet Union on behalf of the Reagan administration and its National Security Council. As a result of that and related circumstances, sometimes we get what are called walk-ins. And about now, almost 2 years ago, we received such a walk-in in New York, and it was from a man, he'll be called Victor. And I had a discussion with him, a meeting with him, and he made me to understand that he had a certain relationship with the Russian government that he wished me to understand had caused him to be in the United States for 30 years and act as a briefer, back-channel briefer, on questions of nuclear policy, and that the Russians were particularly alarmed because they found that it had become increasingly difficult to convey the urgency of their sense of anxiety about American policy. Subsequent to that discussion, there have been several persons that have talked about this, and I'm going to reference this quickly, and I'm referencing it after the remarks I made initially because my intent is not to be alarmist about this. My intent is to make sure that people are updated as to what others are actually saying, what's actually out there right now. There are a couple of particular things I'd like to call to your attention. December of last year now, December of 2014, Press TV reported the release of a statement by 120 international leaders warning of a new danger of thermonuclear conflict. I just want to first indicate some of the people that signed this. John McCole, former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe; David Richards, ex-chief of the British Defense Staff; American General James Cartwright, former Vice Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Their statement said, among other things, quote, "We believe the risks posed by nuclear weapons and the international dynamics that could lead to nuclear weapons being used are underestimated or insufficiently understood by world leaders." And it went on to talk about conflict hotspots. I'm not, as I say, going to go into details. We can discuss any of this if you wish in the questions and answers. Matthew alluded to Mikhail Gorbachev's remarks. These have happened now on several occasions. He began being quoted on this back in November of last year. And on January 29th, he made the following statement. He said, this was in an Interfax news agency interview. He said, quote, "Plainly speaking, the United States has already dragged us into a new Cold War, trying to openly implement its idea of triumphalism. What's next? Unfortunately, I cannot be sure that the Cold War will not bring about a hot one. I'm afraid they might take that risk." And it went on. Now that was that interview. There was also an RT broadcast interview in which he stated, quote, all we hear from the United States and the European Union now is sanctions against Russia. Are they completely out of their minds? The U.S. has been totally lost in the jungle and is dragging us in there as well. Now, there have been various comments in the American press. One of the ones that's more interesting because it alludes to something different, which I want to reference, is an individual by the name of Stephen Starr, I believe. Let's see if I have his oh yes, senior scientist for the Physicians for Social Responsibility, director of the Clinical Laboratory Science Program at the University of Missouri. Now, what he's talking about is what he calls the lethality of nuclear war, and he, somewhat like my friend Victor, expressed his concern, and it was this. He said, on 2 occasions, in 2010 and then in April of last year, April 20th, 2014, he said that he had a discussion with various high-level American negotiators on the START Treaty, for example, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Rose Gottemoeller. And he's referring here to U.S. officials that were sent to brief representatives of the NGOs at the Non-Proliferation Treaty preparatory meeting at the UN. here's what he said. He said, are you gentlemen aware that if 1% of the nuclear arsenals of either Russia or the United States were used, that would be sufficient to create the conditions of a global thermonuclear winter? And if that occurred, it would wipe out large amounts of life on Earth, or would lead to a famine that would do the same for 2 to 3 billion people. He said he was alarmed that in each case, the people that he talked to said they were not aware of that. Now, while that may seem, again, to not be a related point, here's what the problem is. In the recent days, meaning in the last period of the last several months, the Obama administration, in particular the case of Ukraine, has clearly operated from the standpoint of extending NATO to the Russian border. As some are familiar, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, one of the major worries at the time was that there were 300,000 Russian and Warsaw Pact troops deployed in Germany. And those troops were withdrawn on the premise that NATO would not be extended to the Russian border. That has now occurred. The additional problem is that, as some of you may know, back in 2006, there was a document in Foreign Affairs, article called "The Rise of U.S. Nuclear Primacy." This was written by Kyra Lieber and Darrell G. Press. You can take a look for this if you're interested, in which they said the following, and I think it's important because this is now the operational doctrine of the United States Strategic Rocket Forces. They said, during the Cold War, many scholars and policy analysts believed that mutual and assured destruction made the world relatively stable and peaceful because it induced great caution in international politics. Calls on such other things. Critics of MAD, however, argued that it prevented not great power war, but the rolling back of the power and influence of a dangerously expansionist and totalitarian Soviet Union. The debate around mutual and assured destruction may now seem like ancient history, but it is actually more relevant now than ever because the age of MAD is nearing an end. Today, for the first time in almost 50 years, the United States stands on the verge of attaining nuclear primacy. It will probably soon be possible for the United States to destroy the long-range nuclear arsenals of Russia or China with a first strike. This dramatic shift in the nuclear balance of power stems from a series of improvements in the United States nuclear systems, the precipitous decline of Russia's arsenal, and the glacial pace of modernization of China's nuclear forces. Unless Washington's policies change or Moscow and Beijing take steps to increase the size and readiness of their forces, Russia and China and the rest of the world will live in the shadow of U.S. nuclear primacy for many years to come. All right, now we will come to the point of this report. This report is not written from the standpoint of, oh my God, we're about to have nuclear war and we hope that we can stop it and we'd like to talk about good things that are happening. There's a very specific set of discussions that happened between Putin and Xi Jinping during last year, and particularly in May, when the natural gas, the 30-year, $400 billion 30-year proposal on the natural gas collaboration was signed. One part of the communique that was announced stated this between the two leaders at that time, quote, increasing the effectiveness of collaboration in high technology areas, priority projects in the international use of nuclear energy, civil aviation, and a program of cooperation in basic research on space flight satellite observation of the Earth, satellite navigation, and research into deep space and manned space travel. And it goes on to talk about this as being a major area of collaboration between the two nations. That further militarization of space should be prevented, and that the unilateral stationing of defense installations was the destabilizing process. Now, I don't know how aware you may or may not be of the Chinese lunar program proposals. They're very well known in the United States. They center around what the United States lunar program used to center around. That is the mining of the substance helium-3 on the moon. In the days of the early NASA program, scientists such as the German Kraft Erika and others, in their discussions of the original lunar program, always vectored that program, not from the standpoint of having a man land on the moon for the purpose of creating headlines in the newspapers about the greatness of human achievement. No, purpose was, from that time, the industrialization of the moon, and specifically the mining of helium-3. Now, this is of significance for our discussion today, and is the essential point, really, I want to make about our discussion, because from the time of Dwight Eisenhower, the American nuclear program has never been, from that time, a nuclear fission program. The American nuclear program was a nuclear, thermonuclear, that is, fusion program. And when Dwight Eisenhower spoke about what he termed atoms for peace, his notion was that the danger was that for the first time in American history, the American military would become a permanent installation. That is, after every other war in American history, the military forces had always been decommissioned and demobilized. But because of the creation of nuclear weapons, there was now what, of course, famously be referred to as the military-industrial complex. So what Eisenhower moved to do was to create what he called atoms for peace. At that time, of course, it was largely things like the Operation Plowshare program, the use of peaceful nuclear explosives, and that kind of thing. But what in fact occurred during the period of the 60s and the 70s, and Kennedy's space program had elements of this. For example, for those of you who may remember the nuclear rocket program of Kennedy. This is one of these areas which is not well known, but anyone who has thought seriously about the idea of deep space travel, such as a mission to Mars, knows that that's not going to be done with chemical rockets. It's going to be done with nuclear rockets. And this was all integrated at the time into the Kennedy space program of that period. The Chinese space program is for the purpose of mining helium-3 on the moon. This is considered by certain forces in the United States to be a casus belli, cause of war. This will not be discussed, and you will not find it publicly discussed. Well, what has been going on, and this has been sort of a, if you will, I won't call it a secret war merely, but there's been a conflict that is unacknowledged, and it has to do with the control of the energy resources of the future. Unfortunately, there have been many things said about this which have been disinformational for many years, but our forces, our organization, the Executive Intelligence Review, for some of you may know this, some of you may not, but Lyndon LaRouche in specific, who founded EIR back in January of 1974, in that same year was the founder of what was called the Fusion Energy Foundation. It was a group of scientists and people who were interested in science who were promoting thermonuclear fusion energy. In April of 1975, LaRouche wrote a proposal called How the International Development Bank Would Work. And if you look at Xi Jinping's Asian Infrastructure Investment Fund, which was announced first in October of 2013, you'll find striking parallels between the LaRouche International Development Bank proposal and that proposal. Now, of course, that was a much earlier proposal, 40 years ago. But there's one part I'd like to tell you about from that 40-year-ago proposal, and I'd like to say something to you about the occasion for the release of that proposal. In that proposal, on page 20 of that proposal, Mr. LaRouche talks about what he calls CTR, or controlled thermonuclear reactions. And the specific conception he lays out there is, given the processes of imperial looting of Africa, Asia, and South America over many decades, many people have talked about how these countries would ever somehow catch up to the West. And he proposes there that there is no way for those countries to catch up to the West by means of monetary compensation, by means of a loan system to those countries. It's not a matter of giving people loans or grants and trying to somehow integrate them into a certain rate of development, which will be combined and uneven relative to the advanced sectors. Rather, what must be done is to implement a policy of a crash program to establish commercially viable controlled thermonuclear reactions as the premise and basis of energy throughput and energy usage worldwide. Now, this was not some kind of pie-in-the-sky proposal. This came out of the discussions that we were having with American scientists who were already doing these things in 1974. And the Russians were doing things in the same area. They were more advanced than the United States at that time with laser focus in particular, and their notion and their ideas about the actual physical geometry and physical principles involved. This came about because of their mastery of the work of Vladimir Vernadsky, the great Russian scientist and biogeochemist, whose work had become integrated from the standpoint of its fundamental theoretical underpinnings into the nuclear doctrines of Marshall Sokolovsky. Kennedy was aware of this in '62, and one of the reasons that in June of '63 at American University he was proposing joint Russian-American collaboration in space was because Kennedy was aware that the Russians, while they were not able to build laser-based defense weapons or anything like that, were more theoretically advanced than the United States. That advancement level, or that superiority continued into the late 70s, but changed in the 1980s. In any case, LaRouche was, on behalf of the Reagan administration, a back-channel negotiator with the Russians on what later became known as Star Wars, but was called by Reagan the Strategic Defense Initiative. If you look in Russian literature of the last 3 or 4 years, you will see something called the SDE, the Strategic Defense of the Earth. Now, this is a set of proposals that have been advanced by the Putin administration to the United States as a way of attempting to return to the earlier discussions that LaRouche had initiated during the period of 1981 to 83 with the Russians, which were then rejected by the Russians at that time. Elements of the Russian establishment at that time were in severe disagreement with the idea of the Soviets then trusting the United States on any of these matters, and those negotiations ended about 2 months prior to President Reagan then announcing the policy, which caught the Russians unaware. What was not also clear, and should be made clear here, was that that policy at that time was not American policy. That was Ronald Reagan's policy. It was not the policy of James Baker, who was Secretary of State. It was not the policy, that's just my timer, of Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. It was an initiative taken by Reagan, and Reagan singularly, together with his National Security Council members, Judge William Clark, and a few people in that sector. The Bush forces were vehemently opposed to this, and are vehemently opposed to this day. The Bush policy is the policy that you all became familiar with during the period of the 1988 through 92 administration, in which, remember, Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense, and the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, occurred. which was preceded, of course, by the war in Panama. It's something not to be underestimated. But I mention this because on May 20th May 5th rather, excuse me, the 20th of May of 1990, there was a meeting that happened at the White House involving Cheney and Colin Powell and Louis Libby and Wolfowitz. And this was the so-called the 520 committee discussions. It was from these discussions that the still present policy of the United States administration was first shaped. And that was that in the aftermath of the fall of the wall, would the United States pursue a policy of dismantling of NATO and a sort of a pullback from Europe, or would there be, if you will, for lack of a better historical analogy, a kind of Delian League policy? If those of you are familiar with the post-Greek, post-Salamis, Battle of Salamis policy of Athens, in the forming of the naval alliance called the Delian League, which, because of the way in which it was used for purposes of attempting to dominate the Aegean and the various Greek city-states, essentially created the conditions of the Peloponnesian War. Yes, at the time, the Athenians believed that this was going to create a great empire for them, and they did pursue that outlook. And they destroyed themselves through that process, and essentially Greece never recovered from that process. Hopefully the new government that's come in, which has some policies and has some members with whom we're familiar, will have better luck. But I'm saying this because the present American policy is suicidal, destructive, and is delusional. It's significant to say that and to try to now unpack that from the standpoint of that not merely being epithets. Mr. Starr references one thing with respect to the Obama administration. Just want to reference this for a moment because it may... He says this. Again, remember, he is the Physicians for Social Responsibility. He just says, it is frightening that President Obama and his administration appear unaware that the world's leading scientists have for years predicted that a nuclear war fought with the United States and or Russian strategic nuclear arsenal means the end of human history. Do they not know of the existential threat these arsenals pose to the human race, or do they choose to remain silent because this fact doesn't fit into their official narratives? We hear only about terrorist threats that could destroy a city with an atomic bomb, while the threat of human extinction from nuclear war is never mentioned, even when the United States and Russia are each running huge nuclear war games in preparation for a U.S.-Russian war. I have a friend by the name of Ann Lee. I think some of you may have heard of her. She wrote the book, What the U.S. Can Learn from China. It's a well-known professor at NYU. She spoke at one of our conferences in December, and at that time, what she stated was that friends of hers at the War College, United States War College, had expressed alarm because they noted that whenever the Chinese delegations would visit, they were always taken into and had discussions with Americans about war games that they had conducted and were conducting with China. And these always were of a nuclear variety. Importantly, with respect to the foreign affairs doctrine, foreign affairs article that I stated before, what has happened is the following. There is an idea, sort of the same sort of idea. It's an idea that utopians like the earlier General Curtis LeMay held at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that idea is that there's some way to sneak attack the Russians. Now, Snowden's exposés of cyber warfare are pertinent in this regard because these utopians believe that they are capable, or they have capabilities, that might allow them to knock out sophisticated computer and computer-based electronics that the Russians and others use for their guidance systems for nuclear missiles, and that the combinations of those and advanced drone capability would allow you, if you were, for example, in Kiev, to outfit those drones with either sort of bunker buster conventional weapons or tactical nuclear devices, and that there could be a way, or might be a way, to launch such a strike that you could significantly weaken, or if not knock out, major Russian capability. Now, clearly, for those of us who are still on this side of sanity, these things would be, shall we say, unthinkable. Except there's a problem. There are no war technologies in history that have not been used. The notion that a continuous refinement of weapons in the tactical nuclear realm would never be used in a conflict is precisely that what will guarantee that they would be used. It is precisely that kind of delusional capability, which is now rife in the American establishment, and which you see in the case of the Ukraine policy, where a coup was made by American and British and related intelligence in Ukraine, and installing a cabinet, all of whose members speak English as a second language or third language. And yet, at the precise time that we come to the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, which has a completely different significance in Russia than it has in the United States, with Ukraine, of course, being in the kind of chaos it's in presently, there's no sensitivity to the idea that the combination of sanctions on Russia and promotion of and defense of that present government in Ukraine can figure in the strategic military assessments and judgments of Russian military officials. That's kind of stupid, but that's nonetheless the way it is. Now, the significance of this proposal is the following. The Russians have proposed to the United States, have attempted to engage the United States in something called strategic defense of the earth. The United States refuses to so engage, and the Obama administration, in its takedown of NASA in particular, and its lunar programs in particular, specific, shows no inclination to admit the degrees to which their own use of both cybernetics and other means and satellites are intended for warfighting, including using space-based technologies for that purpose. So they don't want to admit it. So the problem that you have presently to be solved, and it can be solved, is that there has to be a notification of the American population and of other populations that these proposals exist. The Silk Road proposal exists, that the United States could join the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa in a joint collaboration for economic and infrastructural development, and that there is a military strategic proposal also on the table called the Strategic Defense of the Earth, coming from particularly Russia, but in specific that the Chinese lunar program's commitment for the mining of helium-3 provides another basis for the United States to enter into a joint cooperative venture. This does not require war fighting, of course. Matter of fact, it militates against it. But it would mean the end of the pursuit of the forms of imperial policy which are characteristic of the NATO deployments, forward-based deployments, and diplomatic advancements of the same type. Now, as an American, I don't look at this policy, if you will, as an American policy. I see it as an Anglo-American policy. You're probably familiar with LaRouche and what he said about these things over time, so I won't take a lot of time on that. The purposes of this forum and otherwise of the forums that we're trying to do in other parts of the globe now is to unpack this initiative, let people know what's really involved and why there's real hope for it, but at the same time make the point that there's a kind of clock ticking and that the present circumstances, particularly in the financial field, are such that we could see something along the lines of the detonation that we saw in 2007 and 2008. Were that to occur, the instabilities that would be in evidence as a result might lead easily to strategic miscalculation. And with that strategic miscalculation, possibility, even probability of a thermonuclear exchange not only cannot be ruled out, it has to be assumed as possible and therefore preventable. So that's how we're basically doing what we're doing. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I think the only thing I'd like to say in conclusion is anything that I've said, which I can answer, I certainly be happy to answer. If there's something that you need in writing, I can try to provide that. And I would urge that everybody, if possible, get a copy of this report. And take a look at it yourself, and you can check any of the things that I've asserted here in various ways, which may or may not satisfy you, but in any case, it's all documentable. Okay, so I think I'll stop there.